All right, fantastic. I often tell people not to begin with apologies, but I want to begin having circulated the paper today with a couple of apologies and some thank yous. First, thank you to Fabrizio and Marco for organizing this. It's been a really wonderful seminar so far, and I wish I could have been more of a participant in it. But I want to begin by apologizing that I wrote this paper very quickly and trying to get my ideas together before I consulted the literature. And with thanks to some comments from Emily Prychitco, I started going back and looking at some more recent papers by Beata, Tota, Marie Kaiser, and Lena Kastner as well should be on this list. And I have yet to incorporate their work into what I'm talking about today. And I think there are many places where there's overlap. And I'm hoping today that I'll get some more ideas for literature that I should be using to triangulate on my own views on the matter. I also want to apologize, I guess, at the beginning for the fying and the sighing. I have a feeling that this technical vocabulary that I introduced in 2007, where the phi was supposed to be for something roughly physiological and the sighing was supposed to be for something roughly psychological, but they came to be generics for describing things at different levels. A colleague of mine recently said that she was going to take all of my phis and psis away from me, and that's probably a good idea. But nonetheless, that's the language in which we've begun to discuss these things, and I'll persist in that way. And I also want to say thanks to as I've started to go back over this literature, it's very exciting for me to see that work on constitutive relevance has really become something of an industry in the philosophy of science, and I'm really excited to see that's happening. When I was looking at the draft of the paper that I circulated yesterday, it seems to me that the tone of that paper is wrong and doesn't really reflect my current orientation towards the material. I think that we're coming to a considerable amount of consensus on this matter, and that there's still more work to be done. And I think that this paper really should be about collecting that consensus and pointing the directions for future work. And I think there are many. I'll try to point to some along the way today. So with those apologies and thanks in mind, let's turn to the paper. The paper concerns what I called in 2007 the problem of constitutive relevance, and that problem occurred to me as a student of Wesley Salmon, precisely because Wes Salmon in his work on causal mechanical explanation had emphasized the importance of causal relevance in thinking about explanation. I can take birth control pills every day and fail to get pregnant, but it's not the birth control pills that prevent me from getting pregnant. They're irrelevant, but nonetheless regularly associated with my non-pregnancy. And so Salmon's point with that kind of example was that the Hempelian model of explanation needed to be supplemented with an account of causal relevance or some kind of explanatory relevance. In his hands, it was causal relevance that would do the work, that would sort the relevant antecedents from the irrelevant antecedents. Now, at the end of Salmon's 1984 book, Explanation in the Causal Structure of the World, he has a nice taxonomy where he talks about two aspects of causal mechanical explanation. The first, which is what we've been discussing up to this point, is the etiological aspect, where you explain an event by situating it in the causal structure with respect to its antecedent causal structure. That's shown at the bottom here in the past light cone of the event. That's the football in the middle of the diagram. But he says that there's also another kind of explanation, a constitutive form of explanation that is ubiquitous in, say, the physiological sciences, in which we try to explain an event by understanding its internal causal structure rather than its antecedent causal structure. And almost none of the work in Wes Salmon's huge corpus of writing is dedicated to understanding that form of explanation. It's really something of an afterthought for him that it must be analyzable along the same lines, but he doesn't really work it out. And I think much of what I was doing in the first 10 years of my career was trying to flesh out that aspect of Wes Salmon's project. And one of the first things that occurred to me was that when you look inside an event like the explanandum E here, and you have to find these causal structures, that issues of causal relevance or explanatory relevance are going to arise there too. You could have irrelevant correlates that are a part of the system, but don't really make any contribution to how the system works. And then it seemed to me that a fundamental question for any adequate account of constitutive relevance would be how to sort the relevant components of a mechanism from the irrelevant components of a mechanism. And that's really the topic of our conversation today. So as I say here, what does it or should it mean for a spatiotemporal part of a mechanism to be a relevant component in a mechanism for a given phenomenon? And it occurred to me, this is even in more detail than is in the written version of the paper, that there are really three questions here, and I should put them in a different order. Let's start with the semantic question. What do we intend to assert when we assert that a given part is relevant to a given phenomenon? What is the claim of the explanatory? What's the content of the claim that some X's phi-ing is relevant to some S's psi-ing? And then I think there's, secondly, a metaphysical question. It's what makes it true, or what are the truth makers of those claims? So what in the world makes it true that a given part is relevant to a phenomenon? And then I think there's an epistemological question. How do we know that an item is a relevant component in a mechanism for a phenomenon? Now, I take myself in 2007 to have really tried to address the third of those questions, an epistemological question. I'm not sure I was entirely clear about that at all times, but for reasons that I'll get into in just a second. That's what I take myself to have done. I should say that I take that epistemological question to have evidential bearing, at least, on both the semantic and the metaphysical question, because what we intend to assert when we claim that something is relevant to something else ought to show up in our practices for giving evidence in support of that claim, and also ought to make sense of the metaphysics of what we take constitutive relevance to be. So I think the epistemological question is really just a window on the semantic and the metaphysical questions, and I think that we ought to be aiming for satisfactory answers to all three of those. This all is taking place against a backdrop of a set of commitments that I have that are worth reviewing at the start of this conversation, just so that we're get this psi-ing and phi-ing defined correctly. There's this diagram on the left here where you've got S's psi-ing at the top. That's some behavior of a mechanism as a whole. Why is there an S and a psi? Well, the S is really just for some sort of material object, say the mechanism as a whole, and psi-ing is something that it does. And I suppose that I chose this language to honor the idea in the Machammer, Darden, and Craver 2000 paper that mechanisms involve acting entities and that we should make the activities explicit. That's done again at a lower level, which is in the next tier of all of this, where I've got a set of X's phi-ing. They're different X's and they're engaged in different sorts of activities, and the arrows are the causal interactions among those. And then we could also go into one of these X's phi-ing and we could describe the mechanisms that underlie that. So here we've got a series of mechanistic levels. At the top is some phenomenon that we're trying to explain. Beneath that is the mechanism that explains it, all the entities and interactions and organizational features that are responsible for S's psi-ing. And then we could look into those parts and break them into component mechanisms, such as at the bottom here. And that gives us an iterative levels hierarchy that's defined locally, that seems to me to capture an important aspect of the explanatory structures that one finds in the neurosciences and in biology quite generally. The idea of constitutive relevance is crucial here because this sort of mechanistic level is not merely a part-whole relationship in any standard sense that, you know, the first three words of this sentence are a part of this sentence, or this chunk of this table is a part of this table. We're really after something like the active contribution, the working parts of a mechanism, not merely the spatiotemporally contained parts or something like that. It is true that all of the parts and their activities are spatiotemporally contained within S's psiing. That's an important component of this whole thing. But we're after something much more fundamental, which is that they make a contribution to the system, and that's what the idea of constitutive relevance is really trying to get at. So maybe that's all I want to say about mechanistic levels. Let me see if I can, there we go. Another backdrop component, so constitutive relevance is really about the relationship between these different levels of organization. We'll be asking, in virtue of what is X's psiing relevant to S's psiing, or what does it mean to assert that X's psiing is relevant to S's psiing? Another component in my thinking about all of this is something that I borrowed from Jim Woodward many years ago, which is if you're going to talk about causal mechanical explanation, you have to have some way of thinking about causation and causal relevance. And for that purpose, I adopted Jim Woodward's manipulationist account of explanation, where X is explanatorily relevant to Y just in case there's a potential intervention on X that can be used to change the value of Y, or that you can wiggle Y by wiggling X. That it's worth, because it's relevant to the problems that arise here in just a second, just going through this diagram on the bottom right. Here we're exploring a relationship between X and Y, and we want to know whether X is explanatorily relevant to Y, or I guess we could say in this case whether X is a cause of Y. And what we would do in order to assess that is intervene on X and see whether we can change the value of Y by changing the value of X. That sort of experiment will go wrong in cases where the intervention itself, whatever intervention methodology we're using, not only changes the value of X, but also changes the value of Y directly. So we have to stipulate, which is what this little line I1 stands for, we have to stipulate that the intervention does not change Y directly. We have to stipulate that the intervention does not change something that is causally intermediate between X and Y, such as S, as indicated by this little line I2, and that the intervention technique is not correlated with some other variable, C in this case, that is a cause of Y, and that's represented here by I3. So the claim that Woodward wants to make is that the assertion that X causes Y means that if I were to intervene on X in a way that satisfies all of these requirements, then I could change the value of Y. And I hope to use that to understand what it means for the different components in a mechanism to interact with one another. And it does a really good job, in fact, handling the issue of relevance for causal claims. If you take my birth control pills away with an intervention, it will not be the case that I end up getting pregnant. And we could do that for any of the cases. You can kill the rooster, but the sun will still rise. You can wash your yellow hands, but you might still get the lung cancer. It handles issues of causal relevance especially nicely. And the whole idea behind the mutual manipulability account and my account of constitutive relevance is to try to take this apparatus and to apply it to interlevel relationships as one sees here. Oh, I should say, these dotted lines here are meant to suggest a kind of intimacy. One might say identity, but there are reasons that I want to hold off from saying identity in these cases, but a kind of intimacy between S's psiing and the organized collection of X's psiing. Certainly supervenience is a word that will come up in just a second. It's also an important background assumption here that interlevel causation doesn't make much sense, and so whatever we have to say about constitutive relevance, it should not be that it's just a species of causal relevance or that it's a straightforward species of causal relevance. Although the account that I'm going to suggest is that it can be analyzed in terms of causal relevance. It's we shouldn't see the lower level things as causally interacting with the higher level thing, and we shouldn't see the higher level thing as causally interacting with the lower level thing. And the reason for that is, I think, nicely illustrated by this diagram. So if we take S's psiing to be an input-output relationship between the inputs of the mechanism and the outputs of the mechanism. So take S's psiing to be the transition between this arrow and this arrow, which I should also emphasize is the same as the relationship between this arrow and that arrow. If we take S as psiing to be that input-output transition, and we take the mechanism to be what lies between the inputs and the outputs to psi, now let's imagine a situation where we intervene into one of the components and we wiggle it and we change the output of the mechanism. Should we say that that component is a cause of S's psiing? No. We should say that it's a cause of O. That's perfectly reasonable. And you could imagine intervening on C and detecting a change in O. But the change that we introduce into C does not produce the transition between input and output. It merely produces the last half of that transition between input and output. So as a sort of argument sketch over here, I say as the first premise that I to O is the phenomenon. The input-output transition is the phenomenon. And the input-output transition is, as a matter of fact, mediated by A, B, C, D, and E. And it is the case that C causes O, but C does not cause the transition between I and C, so C does not cause the transition between I and O. And I think that this at least helps to make explicit some of the things that people like Lewis and Salmon had in mind when they said that the cause cannot be part of the effect and the effect cannot be part of the whole. And I think this does something to articulate what's weird about the idea of interlevel causal relationships. I also think that it helps to explain the notion of fat-handedness that will become important for Baumgartner and Gebharder's criticisms of the mutual manipulability account. Anytime I intervene to change the transition between input and output, I'm going to have to change one of these causal intermediaries necessarily. All right. So the view of mutual manipulability that I developed was an attempt to take the Woodward apparatus and apply it to these interlevel cases. And I spelled it out somewhat infelicitously as two different criteria, one that's meant to be a top-down relationship and one that's meant to be a bottom-up relationship. The reason for that is that I was attempting to ape a standard structure of interlevel experiments in the neurosciences and indeed in biology and other sciences quite generally. What I think of as bottom-up and top-down experiments. Let's start with the top-down experiment. That would be something like using fMRI or in which you engage the subject in some kind of task. You put them in the input conditions. You engage the mechanism in its activity. You might monitor whether the person is actually doing the task as an output condition. And then you observe the component parts to see whether they change during the performance of that higher level task. That's a top-down experiment. And a bottom-up experiment, there are really two kinds that are common in the neurosciences and beyond. One is where you intervene and you take out a part and you observe that the phenomenon, the behavior of the mechanism as a whole is altered or no longer occurs as a result of that removal. Or alternatively, you can intervene into the part and stimulate it and see whether you can stimulate the behavior of the mechanism as a whole as a result. Now, I think I poorly drew these diagrams. These are the diagrams that appeared in the 2007 book, because the intervention technique seems to be going into God knows where in the lower level mechanism, and the detection technique seems to be coming out of God knows where in the higher level circle. Similarly, the intervention technique in the top-down experiment seems to be, as it were, attacking the entirety of S's psiing, and the detection technique seems to be detecting God knows what. Again, the picture is really unclear. But the idea behind these is really spelled out in CR1 and CR2, which weren't as clear as I would have liked to have made them. But CR1 says that when phi is set to the value phi1 in an ideal intervention, psi takes on the value f of phi1. That's intended to handle the bottom-up sorts of experiments. And then CR2 is intended to handle the top-down sorts of experiments. If we set psi to the value psi1 in an ideal intervention, then phi takes on the value f of psi1. I was very clear, I think, in the 2007 book, or tried to be, that this is merely a sufficient condition. The book actually lists several kinds of mechanisms that wouldn't be able to satisfy both of these conditions, even though we would be inclined to say that the thing is a part of the mechanism. For instance, if you've got I'll mention one right now. If you've got a part that is, we'll take take what's a good example? Take the chemical composition of a filament in a light bulb. While the light bulb is glowing, that chemical composition need not be changing. The chemical composition is no doubt relevant to the fact that it glows in the way that it does, but the chemical composition need not change as a part of the operation of the mechanism. These CR1 and CR2 are clearly formulated to handle things that change during the operation of the mechanism, not things that stay the same. And so anything that stays the same during the operation of the mechanism won't be picked up by this sort of method, which is why I said that mutual manipulability is a sufficient condition. And in my framing of it, I say that, that X's phying is constitutively relevant to S's psiing if, and I intend that language to model the logical structure of a sufficient condition. I mentioned that in part because Baumgartner and Gebhardt seem not clear on that matter, but I just want to be perfectly explicit about it here. And part of the reason that I was thinking that is that mutual manipulability is purely an evidential relationship. It tells us under what conditions would you be warranted in saying that X's phying is relevant to S's psiing. It doesn't tell you what it means for X's phying to be relevant to S's psiing. And so I think we should really understand it as an evidential epistemic relationship that's being spelled out here, and one that gives us indication of what the interlevel constitutive relevance relationship must be, but one that doesn't by itself provide an analysis of that constitutive relevance relation. All right. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, and now I think we've got all of the components that are required to see what Baumgartner and Gebhardter's criticism is. By the way, I don't think this is unique to Baumgartner and Gebhardt. I think that now something like this complaint has been made in several places. Bert Luridan is probably the first person I know to have objected that there's some sort of incompatibility of the mutual manipulability account and Woodward's view of manipulationism. But I see that Lena Kastner has also voiced these kinds of criticisms, and Baumgartner and Gebhardt as well. And the idea, I think, is relatively simple here. If it's the case that the behavior of the mechanism as a whole, that is, S's psiing, supervenes on the organized activities of its parts, then it's impossible for one to intervene to change the behavior of the mechanism as a whole without changing the behaviors of one or more of the parts. CR2 demands that one change S's psiing without also directly or indirectly intervening on X's phying. CR2, for that reason, seems to demand the impossible. That is, it tells us, and really the problem is with top-down experiments, bottom-up is just not a problem so far as I can tell, but if you intervene onto S's psiing as a whole, then necessarily you have to change one of these lower-level components, and that means that this Woodward condition here can't be satisfied because every time I intervene on the putative explanatorily relevant factor, I also change the explanandum phenomenon, and I do so directly, and that means that there's something incoherent about the application of Woodward's view to mutual manipulability and to these different relationships. Now, in their characteristic care and rigor, Baumgartner and Gebhardt go through some possibilities for thinking through how this intervention might look. They consider three possibilities. The first one is that our intervention onto the higher level system changes the behavior of the higher level system, and then that causes a change in the lower level component of the phying of X. That is, one intervenes on psi, which then causes phi to change in some way. And another possibility is that when you intervene on psi, this is B, when you intervene on psi, that causes this intervention in fact causes a change to the part phi, and that causes a change to psi. Now, Baumgartner and Gebhardt are right that A and B both run afoul of my desire to eliminate the possibility of interlevel causation in these mechanistic systems, and so neither A nor B would be attractive to me as potential solutions. And then they say, well, the only other possibility is that the intervention onto the system is a common cause of both the phi-ing and the psi-ing, so you'd have a branching structure with an I, and then there would be an arrow pointing into psi and an arrow pointing into phi at the same time. But that then directly runs afoul of the Woodward requirement that if you're going to use these sorts of experimental interventions to test explanatory relevance, then you can't intervene on both the cause and the effect at the same time, or the explanandum and the explanans at the same time. And so there's something, again, incoherent in the problem. So that's the problem that I'm hoping to address, an apparent incompatibility between the theory of mutual manipulability and Woodward's account. Now, Emily, in some earlier comments, pointed out that much of the text looks like I'm attempting to just say, look, I never thought that this was, I always recognized this problem. I knew that, and that's true. That is what's coming across in this text. I don't think that matters so much. What matters to me is that we actually get the answer right. And here is a hint as to how I think we could proceed to get the matter right. So I think there's a fourth way besides the three that Baumgartner and Gebhardt consider, which is to understand the relationship between a mechanism and its parts as a kind of causal betweenness. I think Toda Harrinen is the first person in print to explore this idea in great detail. I think Beata Krickel's emphasis of the temporal parts of S's psi-ing is an important step in this direction as well. And Emily Prychitco, a student here at Washington University, I think is really hammering out in great detail exactly how these experiments will work. Indeed, I'm hoping to enlist her to help me make this paper better so that we can co-author it together. But she's already taken important steps, and I'm probably borrowing from her to some extent in this as well. But the fundamental idea here is, let's think of S's psi-ing, as I said before, as a relationship between an input to a mechanism and its output. So S's psi-ing is in a way a black boxy characterization of the behavior of the mechanism that merely talks about its input conditions and its output conditions and the transition between the two of them. In that case, we can think of the mechanism as what fills the interstitium between the input conditions for psi and the output conditions for psi. And that's represented at the bottom here, where you've got A, B, C, D, E lying between psi in and psi out. So X's phi-ing would be something like C in this picture. Now, I'm going to say this and then I'll come back to it later. John Bickel used to always yell at me about even maintaining the idea of levels in my worldview. He said, why not make it all flat? And in a sense, what I'm doing in the talk today is making it all flat for the purposes of illustrating what's going on in mutual manipulability. Making it all flat for that purpose doesn't, of course, mean that we have to abandon the idea that there are levels of organization. Levels of organization just are ways of drawing circles around this relatively flat structure and black boxing certain things and emphasizing others. But I think that this diagram should help to make explicit what I think of as the relationship between psi-ing and phi-ing, and furthermore to represent that psi-ing is not some sort of addition to the order of being out of the organized components that make up the mechanism as a whole. The mechanism as a whole behaving just or is very intimate with, and I want to say with a nod to Tom Folger, just is the organized collection of those component parts. If we think of it that way, then I think that it's pretty clear how one should approach interlevel experiments. This represents those three. This would be the replacement diagram for this picture. I now would intend something like this to be the replacement diagram, where the bottom-up excitatory experiment is here, the bottom-up inhibitory experiment is in the second row, and top-down activation experiments are in the third row. So just let me walk through these so that we can see how this all would work. So a bottom-up excitatory experiment might be something like Wilder-Penfield's experiments, where he, in patients who had their cerebrum exposed during brain surgery, would drop an electrode in and shock an area of the brain. And then those people who were awake and conscious at the time that this was happening would report having vivid memorial experiences. And that's the kind of thing that I have in mind by a bottom-up excitatory experiment. You intervene into a part, you stimulate it, and then you get the output of the mechanism. And that's what's shown in the top of this diagram. So you intervene into C directly, and you detect the output of that mechanism. And this is really testing whether C is a cause of psi out. In a way, you can think of a bottom-up excitatory experiment as testing that. Now, we could make a more complex form of bottom-up excitatory experiment where you also intervene on psi in, and then you modulate it by intervening on the component parts. That's a complexity that we don't need to get into. But that basically gets at what I should point out is that if you think of a bottom-up excitatory experiment that way, there shouldn't be any Woodwardian problem. You can intervene on C independently of psi out, and there's no possibility that the intervention, if you've done your controls properly, there's no possibility that the intervention also hits psi out. It's a straightforwardly Woodwardian experiment. In a bottom-up inhibitory experiment, this one's a little bit different. What we do is we intervene to take out some component part, in this case, taking out C, and we intervene then to put the mechanism as a whole into its startup conditions. And then we see whether we can get the whether we can get the output conditions out of the mechanism under those interventions. So this is really a two-intervention system where there's an intervention on the input conditions for the mechanism and an intervention on one of the parts to remove it. And then we're seeing whether we can eliminate psi out by doing that. Again, nothing here should trouble a Woodwardian. You can intervene on psi in independently of psi out. You can intervene on C independently of psi out. And so there doesn't seem to be any particular deep problem about how this intervention is possible. Finally, in a top-down activation experiment, which, as I said before, is Baumgartner and Gebharder's main concern, we should consider those as intervening to engage the mechanism as a whole, putting someone in the scanner and telling them what task you want them to perform, and then providing them with stimulus conditions that cause them to start engaging in that task. And then we're going to detect the behavior of the parts of their brain, and we're also going to detect the behavior of the whole organism in that case. So there's an intervention and two detections, but this intervention, again, is causally upstream from, and so Woodward independent of, C and psi out. So there's no violation of any sort of Woodward strictures on experiments if we construe top-down activation experiments in this somewhat unilevel way. I think that there's exactly how we spell this out, and this is where I'm hoping that Emily and I can come to some agreement, or maybe the rest of us, is it really needs to be the case that the values that we're finding for C, or that we're inhibiting, or that we're stimulating, are the same across these different experiments. So it can't just be that we find out that under one set of interventions, C can be used to wiggle psi out, and on another set of interventions, inhibiting C can be used to prevent psi out, and so on down here for top-down activation experiments. We really want it to be the case that, that we intervene on C to fix it to values that are the same values that we're knocking out here and the same values that we're observing here. And I think some constraint like that is going to be necessary so we don't have improperly fitting causal relationships being established by each of these different interlevel experiments. And that's what's going on over here in the left, is how to formulate that sort of constraint. So then I've rewritten mutual manipulability as a way of, so that it makes more sense in light of this way of understanding what's really going on. When an intervention I prevents or inhibits phi, sorry, the screen is now, there we go. When intervention I prevents or inhibits phi or sets phi to off, and psi in is given the value on, psi out takes the value off or impaired. That's a bottom-up inhibitory experiment. When an intervention I stimulates phi or sets phi to on, then psi out takes on the value on. Both of these are the top, both of these are bottom-up experiments. One is inhibitory and one is excitatory for I and E. And then the big problem for Baumgartner and Gebhardt is with CR2, and there I just say that if the intervention I sets psi in to the value on and psi out takes the value corresponding to on, then phi takes the value on. And that's just spelling out that you get a positive result of the top-down experiment. I think Harrinen has a very similar formulation of these different experiments. And both of us stated in this binary form, but I intend it to be general. I just didn't have time to work out how that would go before this presentation. But I think it's fairly clear that, you know, we could introduce functional locution and make it all work. I just haven't spent the time to do that yet. All right. That said, and I now want to return to the fact that this is not a necessary and sufficient condition. It's a sufficient condition. It's intended as a sufficient condition that if those kinds of experiments all work for us, then we're warranted in inferring that this part is relevant to this whole. And that idea really came from work on long-term potentiation in the 1990s, where people were debating how would we really show that LTP is relevant to learning and memory, and they hit on something very much like the mutual manipulability criterion, and it's merely meant to articulate that sort of thought. But as I said before, there will be kinds of components that mutual manipulability won't catch. It won't catch, for example, components that are not driven by something earlier in the mechanism. So components that are not in any sense caused by psi in. They might just be, they might be caused by something else, or they might just be constitutively active in the brain. And in that case, they won't wiggle with psi in, and so they won't be susceptible to the top-down sort of experiments. Similarly, as I mentioned before, unchanging components, the incus, the malleus, the incus and the malleus in the ear have to remain solid for the mechanism to work, but they don't change from being solid to being liquid during the performance of the mechanism. That doesn't mean that they aren't part of the mechanism, or that they aren't relevant to the mechanism. And so we're going to need a broader set of evidential criteria than mutual manipulability could possibly supply. So I think it's at best an empirical sufficient condition, something that's driven by epistemological concerns. And then the question is, what other sorts of evidence would we need for these different kinds of components? To go back to the language that I was using earlier, there's a semantic question. What does it mean for a part to be relevant? And then there's a metaphysical question: in virtue of what do these things satisfy that? And I think that these kinds of components would be perhaps different truth makers for claims about constitutive relevance, that we would need different ways of handling those. Baumgartner et al., I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I think Beata has done a really terrific job. Baumgartner et al.'s version of all of this says that the part is relevant to the behavior of the whole only if there's any possible intervention on the whole is what they call fat-handed. That is, it necessarily changes psi and one or more of the phi-ings. And furthermore, they require that every intervention on the part is necessarily fat-handed with respect to the psi-ing of the whole. That, while perhaps illustrative of why interlevel causation seems to me an unpromising idea. This strikes me as not the most perspicuous formulation of what, of either the epistemological question of how we test for interlevel relationships, or even a perspicuous statement of what it amounts to. As Beata Krickel points out, this formulation is incompatible with the multiple realization of psi by different x's phiing. That's problem 2 here. And I really think that furthermore, this account of constitutive relevance does very little to make the practice of science clear. Scientists never do all of the experiments that would be necessary to establish this kind of fat-handed intervention criterion. This is really the indefiniteness complaint by Krickel, but made really about scientific practice. What they do is the kinds of experiments that I've been talking about. They don't do an inexhaustible set of experiments to show that there's no possible way of intervening on the whole that would change, that would not also change automatically the parts and vice versa. That would be an inexhaustible experimental pursuit. And so even if this formulation of what constitutive relevance amounts to, even if that's true of all cases of constitutive relevance, it's not an especially clarifying account of constitutive relevance. Whereas if we think of constitutive relevance in terms of causal betweenness and inness conditions, then I think we get a perfectly transparent way of making sense of interlevel experiments and why they work. So just to say some things by way of conclusion, to go back to the questions that we've got, what does it or should it mean for a spatiotemporal part to be a relevant component in a mechanism for a phenomenon? If we go to the semantic question, what are we asserting when we claim it? I would say that we assert that the component is at least an inness condition for the occurrence of the phenomenon. I didn't talk in this presentation about Mark Couch's view, but it's one that I think is at least deserves our first pass endorsement. Basically, that every part makes an insufficient but non-redundant part. Each component is an insufficient but non-redundant part of an unnecessary but sufficient condition. I added in my answer to the semantic question that it should be at least an inness condition, because it seems to me that you could have a necessary part or a sufficient part, and that those could also be components, but that seems to me to require further work. As to the metaphysical question, what makes it true that a given part is relevant to the phenomenon? Well, causal betweenness seems to me to be one important truth maker, but it's only one because you've got these things like undriven components and unchanging components that we've got to deal with. And causal, I think by definition, causal betweenness will not handle those. So we're going to need different truth makers for how those things end up being constitutively relevant. And on the epistemological question, I'd say that the 3 interlevel experiments are sufficient at best, but not necessary. And there are truth makers for inness conditions that will not satisfy that requirement. I think we've just got to be honest and about that. So let me just say one thing to ward off one kind of criticism. I mentioned that Bickel was on me about this years ago. Bickel is sort of famous for not liking multi-level world pictures and thinking that everything is just cells and molecules. And have I just ceded the game to Bickel? I think the answer again is no. I'm keeping the variable psi, and I have reasons for keeping the variable psi, having to do with issues of multiple realization that we can talk about if we want to. All I've done is to point out that it's not an addition to the order of being. Rather, it's exhaustively constituted by the mechanism that lies between psi in and psi out. And once we own up to that, then some of the Kim-style worries that are fueling Baumgartner and Gebharder's concerns, I think, start to vanish. I'm not pushing. I'm pushing for a view that Jaegwon Kim, I think, would be perfectly happy embracing, in other words. So what I'm trying to offer here, by way of big picture, is an account of constitutive relevance that helps us make sense of the experiments that are used to establish constitutive relevance, that should fit with how we talk about levels and how we think about levels, and that should fit with a view of causation. I think mutual manipulability is a piece of the epistemic puzzle, and it makes sense as an epistemic achievement if one presumes a given semantics of relevance, that is, that we're after innes conditions for the behavior of the mechanism. And if one recognizes that betweenness is a truth maker for claims about constitutive relevance. And I don't think that it's incoherent at all. Part of what I'm trying to achieve here is a reduction of mutual manipulability to claims about single unilevel causal claims. And manipulationism applies to those unproblematically. To be a component is to make a contribution to a mechanism, and such contributions are causal. And if we can exhaustively list the truth makers for claims about contributions, or make a compelling start of that list, we can build towards an adequate ontological picture of the kinds of structures in the world that make components relevant to the behavior of mechanisms as a whole. And in particular, I think I'll just end on a slide that sort of points in the direction of areas for future development. I say that a component is at least an innes condition for the behavior of a mechanism as a whole, and I think that Couch, while having a really excellent first pass on what constitutive relevance, what we assert when we assert that something is constitutively relevant to something else, I think that we should really just say that it has to be at least an innes condition. It might be something stronger than an innes condition, and I just think that we need to articulate what we really, innes condition is the weakest thing that something could be and be a component in the mechanism. There are stronger things that it could be and be a component in the mechanism, and I think we need to make that explicit. A second thing is that, as I pointed out, I think there are different truth makers for relevance claims beyond causal betweenness. So how do we deal with unchanging and undriven components? That seems to me to be future work to be done. As I pointed out, I think that my current formulation of mutual manipulability is a binary formulation, and I think we need a non-binary formulation of that. And I think mutual manipulability ought to be further refined to adequately handle the overlap of experimental intervention and detective ranges across the different kinds of experiments. And I also think that there's work to be done along the lines that Lena Kastner has been suggesting to investigate non-interventionist forms of evidence for constitutive relevance. I've really focused on the interventionist picture, but certainly given Clark Leamore's work, I think we should expect that constitutive relevance, no less than causal relevance, will yield to non-interventionist methods, and that there are important things that we can learn by studying structures and containment relationships, in addition to studying how things wiggle when you intervene on the different parts. And with that, I think I'll stop and open things up for questions.